So, to intro, by way of introduction for our speaker, Nora, for those of you who do not know, I'm going to do the kind of quick intro and not really read her bio. So, just briefly, I'll share my screen so you guys can have a visual here. She is the author of a book titled Small Arcs of Larger Circles. And also is the director of the International Bateson Institute. And so for those of you who don't know, Nora is kind of in a lineage of systems thinkers, and I'm sure she'll share a little bit about that with us. And however, though she is in a lineage of systems thinkers, and in particular, people are familiar with her father, Gregory Bateson, she is here today for herself. She is a woman. This is the Women in Systems Thinkers series. We're really interested to hear, Nora, today about you and your perspective, and obviously your warm data work, and any upcoming events and all of that. And we're just going to kind of have a little bit of an extemporaneous conversation, and we'll wrap in this piece about, how can systems thinkers in the world of systems thinkers work together more? And so our focus on women in systems thinking is in part this, maybe if we had more, quote unquote, professional women in systems thinking, high profile sort of luminaries, maybe there would be a little bit more, possibly, maybe of this community orientation, maybe not, women are not always community oriented. Don't want to be too stereotyping here. So we'll wrap in some of this sort of perspective on like, how can we as people who really care about systems thinking and the systems thinking worldview do a better job of being the whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. So we'll try and wrap that in a bit toward maybe the later part of the discussion. So let's switch to you now, Nora. I just want to make sure I know your Wi-Fi was a little sketchy, but are you there, Nora?
I'm good. I'm
Great.
good. And I think it's pretty solid now.
Okay, super. So what would you like to share today with the group about you? Like, where are you at? Where are you at in your work, or, your perspective on whether it's what's going on in the world or the world of systems thinking? What would you like us to know?
Well, um, where I am right now is actually I'm working on some new work, and it's not a theory of change, um, but it's kind of what comes before that. So I published a paper this past year with the International Society of Systems Sciences journal called Aphanipoesis. And the idea of aphanipoesis is that there is a great deal of coalescing of experience happening in unseen ways. And that most of the problems we're trying to respond to right now in the world are you could define as insidious. That is that they are not so easily graspable in their thingness. You want to fix the problem where you see the problem, but actually it's been brewing for a long time in ways that are not actually visible or perceivable. So aphanipoesis is the study of how things coalesce in unseen ways. And for me, this is a really exciting piece of work because it's bringing together some of my favorite systems uh, theorists and scholars, some of the old timers too, looking at my father, of course, but also Charles Saunders Peirce. And in some ways, I think you could say that this work on aphanipoesis, it's a tricky one because what I sometimes feel like I'm, trying to sell fabric to the guy who makes the clothes for the emperor that are invisible, you know? Um, and yet it's so real. So many of the actual things that we're needing to contend with right now are not reachable in the place we're trying to reach them. So, that metaphor of the guy looking for his keys under the street lamp when they're actually lost in the forest. And there's a lot of work being done in places where there is, where we see the problem emerge. But by the time it's emerged, it's been submerging and coalescing for a long time. So responding simply to emergence is coming up to starting to look a little late. And also recognizing, especially in the pandemic, it was really interesting to me to ask this question of what's actually submerging right now? What is taking place in ways that we're not able to perceive yet, that later on we'll look back and say, yeah, that changed in the pandemic. But right now we can't see it because it's still submerging. There are still experiences that are kind of going into the underground and coalescing into each other in ways we're not familiar with. Um, so when we start to ask questions about how do we deal with some of the most pernicious systemic issues, okay, things like racism, like corruption, like addiction, like these are things that are very difficult to fix at the level in which you can see them. You can't go up to somebody and say, "You have to love me now." It's like because there's all this underground stuff, and how to actually begin to become, okay, here we are in a work on systemic women working in systemic process. Well, one of the issues with systemic process all along has been that it didn't work out into the world that wanted linear, visible change that was actually describable and measurable. If you're doing real systemic work, it's actually not going to come out where you think it's going to come out. It's going to come out all over the system. And so
So we're having a little
I
Wi-Fi slowdown.
think I feel like just to continue that difficult process. There we go. Okay. You okay? Are you there?
Oh, I think
I'm
we're
here.
here.
Can you hear
I
me?
think you're back. Yeah. You might need to, are you still there? Uh-oh, we lost her.
Uh,
I hear you.
Oh, you can hear us.
okay.
Maybe just try
Yeah.
turning off your camera for a few moments and then we can turn
Hello?
it back on.
Yep.
Okay, great. We can hear you
Okay.
now. Thanks. So, yeah, let me ask you first if there was more about that you wanted to continue. Otherwise, I'll have a follow-up question in a moment.
Systemic.
Are you there, Nora?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to ask if there was more about what you were just discussing with, I'm going to see if I can say the word here, aphanopoiesis. If you wanted to say more about that before I jump in with some follow-up questions.
Nope. I think we've said it. It's just that looking at the systemics of insidious problems. That's where I am right now, working with that.
Great. So I want to kind of follow up on that, what you were just discussing about that, because there's a lot there. But I wondered if you could give our participants today a little intro to warm data, like just assuming for a moment that everybody's new to it. I know some people are not, but if you could kind of give us the overview.
Yeah. Okay, so warm data, the idea with warm data is to start to look at what it is, to think about information. Okay, and it gets tricky because in a complex living system in particular, all of the organisms or the processes that are taking place um, have their own perspective. They're moving in multiple ways with multiple different kinds of relationship that are producing lots of different kinds of life. All right, and so how do we think about what information is when it's moving in that way? So this was the sort of the core question around warm data. And what I wanted to do was basically point to all of that other information that is not still. So for since the 1600s, we've been looking at producing research information by pulling things out of context. And then you can name them, you can measure them, you can repeat the experiment, you can, get all sorts of information, but you have actually removed it from life. So what do you do when you want to have a better response to life? You're going to need information that is itself alive. Okay, so this is not just qualitative information, and I'm not working in the sort of binary of qualitative and quantitative here. What I'm interested in is, in particular, what Charles Saunders Peirce called abductive process, which has to do with how one context begins to describe another, and how that information is alive. So, you might say, for example, oh, we really need to fix the education system. There's a bad system in the education world, right? So, but the education system is a description of the economic system. It's a description of the political system. It's a description of all sorts of history. It's a description of technology. It's a description of the health system. It's a description of what the family and the culture expects of the next generations. So in order to actually work with the question is, where's the change? Where is this thing that we're working with? Because you can go in and you can implement all kinds of new curricula. And pretty soon the thing gets pulled back into some of the same patterns. And the kids that come through the new groovy program have to get a job in the same system that only responds to, particular forms of grades or whatever. I think you catch my meaning. In other words, it's an ecology. And so warm data is actually, it's a pretty rigorous study, and it has a lot of theory in it. And it's about relational process as information. Okay, so the easiest description is that it's information that's alive, but that's kind of hard to understand. If you were to ask yourself, who am I? And your kids or your friends start to give description of who you are. And then, uh, by the time they do the description, you've changed a little bit. And so what you want is to be able to describe and to think about living systems without using descriptions that are frozen in time. All right, because that's going to get us into all the trouble of labeling and those just completely decontextualized ways of describing ourselves, each other, and the world that we're in. So warm data is about that. There's the warm data processes, which are Warm Data Lab is the sort of in-person version, and the online is called People Need People. And those are processes for actually working with groups of people exploring, mutual learning, and perceiving uh, life, or if you want to call it complexity, um, through the details of your own life experience. So instead of putting a map on the board that says, here's how complexity works, I'm using multiple conversations through multiple contexts to allow people's own life experience to illustrate the complexity, with the idea that every single person has their own version. And that's so much better to work with for me than to have some sort of singular version of complexity that we're trying to plug into. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And for those of you who are joining us today, if there's particular words that Nora or I or anyone else is using that you're not familiar with, feel free to pop those in the chat so that we can spend a little bit of time trying to define those more specifically. And I wonder, Nora, if you could sort of tie these two separate but very related concepts of aphanipoiesis, if I got that right, and warm
Mhm.
data together, like where do they meet?
Yeah, well, what happened was that I was doing warm data for, actually, it's been a decade now that I've been working with this and working with groups around the world with it. And what I kept getting these questions like, well, is this supposed to be a generative conversation? What are we supposed to harvest from this conversation? What are the takeaways? What's the point? What's the product? Right? And I found it very difficult to actually claim the positioning of saying, no, what I'm interested in here is not a product. It's actually a shift in the premises of thinking, a shift in the premises of perception. And from there, everything changes. I don't need to make a list of particular actions that I want to lead out to some strategic goal. What I would need to do is shift the premises themselves that have been so contaminated and contorted and deformed over the last 500 years of separation and industrialism and eugenics and all these things that have come in and warped colonialism, warped perception itself, and warped our language, warped our understanding of what it is to be in relationship with each other and the world, and even how we think about, really basic things: time, love, sex, learning, kids, right? And so I guess my sense is that as I was working with warm data, what I saw is that there was a shift happening. And that shift was taking place in a way that was so profound, but it was so unreadable by existing systems and the interest of existing systems in producing measurable, enacted change. And what I felt very strongly was that that unseen shifting is actually a necessary aspect of evolution itself. Okay, hang with me for a second. And while I ask the question, how does an organism know how to evolve? All right, now if you ask that question, what you start to see is that that organism is used to behaving in a particular way. Whether that organism is me or a hermit crab, it doesn't really matter. That organism is working in an ecology, living in an ecology, responding. How does it know how to change? When all the things it knows repeat the way that it is, how does it change? Now, for me, this is the question, because what we're talking about is that there is some unseen cache of coalescing processes that, when the contextual circumstances and the organism are in some sort of readiness, that shift happens. All right. So what we're asking in another set of languaging is, what is submerging that will later emerge as a behavior, as a change? So that's what I started to see with warm data, is that we were shifting what was submerging. We were making a space for a new kind of perception to take place in that submergent place. And that's really exciting. I think that's so exciting. And it's so alive and so weird and full of just, overlapping stories and things that you can't pull any of them out and say, there it is, this is the change, measure it, name it. Instead, it's like, when you reach for a glass of water on the table, you have a set of understandings about how long your arm is, right? These are the premises. If you have suddenly you have an arm that's quite a bit longer, the way that you reach for that glass of water is changed. Okay, so that's where I'm going. I'm interested in shifting the entire approach to how we think about what is change.
Yeah, and I'm really hearing in what you're saying some echoes of some other frameworks and thinkers and thinking. And this series that we put together has really been influenced by the work of Donella Meadows. And in some ways, I feel like when you first introduced the aphonopoiesis topic, I feel like maybe a very simple, overly simplistic maybe version of that would be like the iceberg analogy that people love to use.
Mhm.
um, but that I think is probably overused. But then moving beyond that, I start to think about Donella Meadows and her the sort of mindsets and worldview, and then the function, purpose, or goal level, and then the interconnections or relationships, and then the elements, behavior, and then events are like that thing you were talking about that's like the thing you can see and tangibilize and is reported on the news. So yeah, some of that's coming up for me as you're describing these various concepts.
Mhm.
Have you kind of gone into the Donella Meadows direction at all? Do you have a familiarity with her work? I mean, I assume you have to some extent, but I'm just
Yeah,
curious.
yeah, of course, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say where this is a little bit different, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I love Janella, but where this is a little bit different is that it's looking at the movement there. So the coalescing
Mm,
itself and really this word that my dad coined, transcontextual. And transcontextual is such a fantastic word because it lets us actually begin to pay attention to how in ecological systems there is a multiplicity of contextual communication that's very different. So the communication that my microbiome is in is a very different kind of communication than the way that I talk to my kids. And that's a really different kind of communication than the way that I might, for example, drive a car. Okay, but those are all forms of communication and being. And so and the way that those different contexts begin to inform each other is really important. This is where that coalescing that I'm talking about is happening. And so my questions really are about what can be done to nourish the flexibility that we don't actually know we're going to need. Right? That's what evolution is doing. It's offering the possibility for changes that are yet unknown to be needed. And that's really different than analyzing a problem and responding to that problem, creating a solution zone and moving toward it. It's a very different set of movements and approaches into that. Is
yeah,
that,
and,
yeah.
yeah, and I feel that that just starts to kind of beg the question a little bit, going back to some things you were saying earlier about, how the world sort of shows up and asks for evidence. It asks for proof, quote unquote. It asks for, and then my personal perspective on that is that we're actually not very good linear thinkers. I feel like when we become systems thinkers, we actually become stronger linear thinkers. But nevertheless, we at least posture in this way that you got to show me evidence, you got to make a timeline, you got to make a plan and follow through. And so given that reality of what the world requests or demands, And then this very, very different, I was glancing at your, the International Bateson Institute website, and at one point somewhere in here it says it's like embrace chaos.
Mhm.
And so that thing of like embracing chaos, of moving into the unknown, of what you were just, I think the word was transcontextuality, of something this intelligence inherent to evolution, that for me I would use the word noetic. And Buckminster Fuller probably, this relates to his comprehensive anticipatory design science. So it's like all these different words that in some ways, and then there's of course biomimicry. And so there's this intelligence aspect, and this knowing, and this experience. And when I brought up the Donella Meadows sort of framework, and you were saying, yes, but it's about the movement between, which again, so hard to sort of grab and tangibilize. And
Mhm.
so given those different realities of what the world sort of demands versus this very important, like right now, we desperately need, like the title of Fritjof Capra and Pierre Luigi Luisi's book, The Systems View of Life, like we desperately need that perspective. Like, where are we? Like, how do we at a grand scale collectively start to sort of more, become greater, basically more sophisticated in, and also kind of going back to our more indigenous roots, like in this ability to feel and sense into and be at play and movement in systems, as opposed to that, show me the evidence. How do we do it, Nora?
Yeah. Well, very carefully, and in fact, because one of the things that I see kind of all over the place that's breaking my heart is that suddenly systemic thinking and complexity has become trendy. And now, for some of us who've been around for a while, this was unthinkable. For so many years, people just went blank in the face when I told them I worked that. They're like, wow, that's really abstract. I was like, actually, it's not abstract. Looking at the world as separate chunks of things that have been objectified, now that's abstract. But this is not abstract. But anyway, there were a lot of glazed eyes for many decades. And now suddenly it's a McKinsey program. Okay, so we're in dangerous waters right now. And that is to say that every grant proposal has to have the word systems and complexity in it. And deep in the epistemology of anybody who's been through the Western school system and lived in this modern world is the patterning of the industrial models. And what I'm seeing all over the place that's breaking my heart is actually that people are using systems and complexity language on completely mechanistic first order problem solving. And so if if there's going to be any integrity to this work and any long term with it, we're going to have to actually pull back from that mechanistic habit. But honestly, it's everywhere. And I remember, sitting with a friend of mine who was looking at, one of these new systems books and said, this is just sort of, embellished first order solutioning. That's all this is. They're using all the language, but none of the actual processes there. And I think there's a real danger of that. And that comes from folks just like wanting to upscale and needing a methodology and putting a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step into it. And then the weirdness is gone. The life is gone. The mushy undercurrents are gone. And it makes it easier if you have a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 methodology. But let's be very clear, at that point, you're no longer doing complexity. I'm just going to say that.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying is very key, and it almost seems like a nuance, and yet it makes all the difference in the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
What the purpose is. And again, I'm kind of referencing Donella Meadows in the background here, but like, that question of what is the purpose? And when you were saying earlier, I love how you used the word describe, like that the current educational system describes, I think if I understood you correctly, the market, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
the what I would call like the profit motive or something to that effect. And so I feel like if I'm understanding you correctly, that what you're saying is, that you're starting to see, and I think we're starting to see some of this word of systems and complexity and, systemic this and systemic that become greater used in the zeitgeist, but that maybe so far, and this is probably typical with trends, the point is sort of being missed, which again goes back to the thing about chaos, for me anyway, and that uncertainty. And the Danella Meadows, et cetera, sort of MIT group of the, dancing with the system and sort of surrendering to the unknown, as opposed to this really intense quest for certainty and control and profit in the background. But so it's definitely a conundrum.
It is, because there's this beautiful line in my dad's book, In the End of Mind and Nature, where he's talking about how all ecologies are tautologies, okay? And that they're working within themselves. So all of the processes confirm the other processes. And that's a very tricky dance to enter when your game plan is change. Are you with me?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So when all the organisms are doing what they do, and that's what is allowing the meadow to continue to be a meadow, there is also this very real element that they are also changing what they do, because there has to be a discontinuing in order for there to be a continuing. So I guess the issue is that, I mean, if you don't be careful, even the sort of trope of uncertainty becomes a trendy parking space and not actually a rigorous process. And really being in that inquiry that is going into that blur is not a slouchy spot. It's not just a let's just all accept the mystery place. It's actually a very rigorous work. And I think one of the things we're looking for in more sort of professional circles, and in sort of in all the processes in the existing system where there is actually a cry for systems change in such a way that it doesn't actually make any change. What you're seeing is that kind of romanticism of the unknown without the actual rigor. Sorry.
Yeah.
To say.
No, and I just, as we're coming up into the last 10 minutes or so of the conversation portion, I just wanted to see if we could shift a little bit to kind of look at the world of systems thinkers, quote unquote professional, and all this, because this group, the impetus behind it and then behind this series is, maybe even though as systems thinkers we really, sort of march around talking about the importance of the system and the whole being greater than the sum of the parts, if we actually look at the world of quote unquote professional systems thinkers or consultants or thinkers or authors or all these participants in this world of systems thinking, complexity, all this systems dynamics and all this, we don't actually see a big coming together of the whole. Rather, like even when I a few minutes ago brought up Danella Meadows, I could feel in the background of myself a little hesitance to sort of introduce a different systems thinker into the conversation when we're focused on Nora Bateson and her father's work. And like I feel like I felt a little kind of like tug, like, oh, should I really bring up a different systems, like that typical kind of dip, 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 right here in this conversation about systems thinking. I was feeling that. So so that kind of pushed me, pull you, oh well, Peter Senge this, oh well, Otto Scharmer that, well, Nora Bateson this, and Danella Meadows that, like that separatio. Like how do we get more to to the, coagula, and then the pyros gamos. Like, how do we get into the realization of the potential of, instead of all of us individual kind of thinkers doing our own thinky stuff with our own little groups, or in some cases big groups, more of that coming together piece. Like, do you have some thoughts about that, given your long history in this world?
Mm. Oh, I so long for that.
Mm.
The coming together, reminds me of that line from the beginning of The Red Tent where she says, Anita Diamant says, "We have been lost to each other for so long."
Wow.
And um, all I can say is that first of all, there's a lot of lurking presuppositions, and so they're down there, and they create competition, and they create a kind of struggle. The people who have been in systems work for a long time, frankly, have been struggling financially. They've been struggling to have their work acknowledged. um, and so it wasn't a comfortable choice to devote one's life to systemic work. It was a choice for life, and it was a choice for the vitality, and it was a choice for future possibilities, but it wasn't a choice for comfort in the present. And it wasn't a choice for being understood. I think that my dad and Bucky and a lot of these people lived pretty lonely lives, actually. And so this loneliness, I think, that you're pointing to is really, it's not about the thinking or the people. It's about the world that we're in, and the separation that is taking place there again and again. And so how we bring this together is actually the ultimate act of rebellion, right? It's this thing of saying, I'm not in this for competition. I don't need to win. I don't need to boost my career. And to do that is actually really dangerous, for your bread and butter. So, that this is something that's right smack dab in the middle of this. And what I would really love to see is more support. And I'm just going to phrase this very, very carefully. I, I think it would be a mishap to fund people to do systems work. Okay? But what would be great is to fund them, and then they can do systems work. And one of those things is a linear causality. And so we're placing the work itself in a linear causality of an economic system that's based on linearities. How to get paid for your work. And what we need to do is disassociate this process from that linearity in order to be able to work together.
Mm.
Mm, great. Well, I agree with that.
Yeah.
And so if I actually, let me just clarify. So I feel like what you're saying, and if I understand it correctly, is it's almost like have faith in this human being, fund their work because you want to sort of put faith in that person and their vision and their work, as opposed to, I'm going to funnel money toward you for this outcome. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I guess what I'm saying is that if you want to actually work toward systemic change, and you want to put people who have studied systemic processes and who have devoted their lives to that, then really what has to happen is that work needs to be decoupled from the linear relationship of I do this to get paid.
Mm,
right? To I do this and I can actually live my life. And the reason that's so important is what you're pointing to right now is a consequence of that, right? The competition and the separatedness that we're seeing has to do with the fact that we're getting paid to instead of getting paid and. What we need to be able to do is support ourselves in this system and do the work that's going to make a new system. And if you're really doing that systemic work, frankly, it's going to undermine the system that's creating the financial payment.
yep,
So just to take the kid gloves right off of that, let's just be clear.
yep,
I
it's
mean,
true.
if systemic work is really working, it's going to undermine the the process that we're looking at. Yeah.
Great. Well, I want to just, given that we're coming up on this hour here, I want to shift a little bit to check with my co-host Carrie and see if you had any specific questions for Nora, and then we'll move into the more general Q&A portion.
Thanks, Felicia. I'm sort of stunned right now, so I'm a little bit speechless at the moment, and I cannot definitely not remember the question that I had coming into this conversation, and I think it's more or less irrelevant now. But I'm just beyond grateful for this conversation, and particularly the piece that you just touched on, Nora, about the funding and versus funding to. And I think we're seeing some trends, and the vocabulary is escaping me right now, but we are seeing some trends in philanthropy regarding this. So Mackenzie Scott is an example, is one example of where it's, you know, I'm going to call it no strings attached, but there's a better, more academic term for that. And so I think there are some signs of hope potentially, and perhaps the generative quality of these conversations that we're having in this series might elicit further thinking and possibly further doing in that direction. That is my hope.
Me too. That's why, actually, that's why, gotta love menopause. I'm just saying it now, like no holdbacks. I just feel like
It is time.
it's time to just say the thing. And there's been years when I've been kind of apologetic and trying to fit things in and trying to make it work. And yeah, your organization will thrive in these circumstances. And then it's like, actually, I don't even care if your organization thrives. Reality, if your organization isn't actually supporting the community and the land and probably it needs to die. So, I became a little bit more radical than I
Mm-hmm.
was before because I started to feel like, well, life's in the offing. The level of destruction that's taking place is too much. And somehow we need to be able to actually advocate for those relationships that produce vitality and life. And like constantly seconding that to the betterment of the economic system is really not okay anymore. So if we're not going to do that together, who is? And I tried to get some of my other systemic friends to step it up. And they were like, yeah, but somebody else will get the bid because they will promise to use the word systems and complexity and get a higher degree of efficiency or optimization in whatever the organizational process is. And they'll get the bid, and I need to pay my rent. And so, I mean, isn't that sad? But that's why I think we're seeing this, Felicia. I think that we're seeing the consequences of people feeling like if I'm the only one who's going to walk into this situation and tell them the truth, which is basically your organization is destroying things. And in order to stop destroying it, it's going to actually have to lose money and probably go bankrupt. And the next person comes in and says, oh, no, we can fix this and you can come out making money. And, you
Yeah.
know, that there it is. So, there's something about how to hold this together in integrity and in care of where it's actually going. And it's not, it's funny. It's like, am I being brave? Well, no, I'm not being brave. It's just that the alternative is to sell out something that is really important for my children's future and your children's future. And it's the same thing that's connected to racism and corruption and addiction. And, it's the same problem in every direction. And it has to do with these habits of putting separatedness and linear causality and financial productivity above life. So
Drop the mic.
Great. Yeah. So, yeah, so much more. I mean, we could certainly continue with this, but we will start to pivot toward the Q&A because I want to make sure to get some of the voices of our participants in here as well and your questions. So let's see. I know that we've had some questions come up in the chat. I
I'm
feel like
loving Jean's quote. Jean just put a quote in from Bucky about, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Yes, that's the thing. And to do that, is something that is like the approach, the way to move into that kind of new model is at first going to seem a little incoherent. It's not going to be familiar. It's not going to walk like the old system, talk like the old system. It's not a duck. So it's, that thing is not going to be readily taken up as like, yeah, this is the new it thing. We're going to upscale it. And it's going to be something that's strange, but feels good. And so I think that's really that, that incoherence is also really something to pay attention to. The projects that don't make any sense are probably the ones that make the most sense.
Yes, yeah, for sure. You need kind of a different level of radar for what you're talking about there than the ones we're used to, for sure.
Yeah.
Suparna, I saw that you had posted a question early on. What's the best way for industry practitioners to learn and apply systems thinking? And you mentioned that you've worked in tech, and I just wonder if you wanted to expand on that question or you have a related one.
Thanks, Felicia. So we had spoken a while ago, so you kind of know a little bit of my history and my journey. And I worked in tech, and I'm solving a problem around connective tech. How do you build technology that does exactly what Nora said? Put relationship at the center, and of course, you need to make a living and all of that, and apply like this structural change to how we think about building things in tech. And so, as a part of this, I've been on this journey for the past several years. I'm going deep into ethical technology, responsible tech, and there's a whole bunch of learning. But I literally had to take a system sabbatical to understand, like, how do you even digest this complexity? It's not one thing, it's many things kind of going together. And I'm still kind of knee deep in it, doing this work alone. And I think I have easily a year ahead of me to build this framework that I can share with other people that are building connective tech spaces, right? And there are like many, many examples. But the fact is that, you kind of need a little bit of an on-ramp for practitioners to really understand. And maybe it's not the McKinsey learn in an afternoon model. I don't know, like, I'm not familiar with that, but I exactly understand, like, you kind of package something and you sell it for quick wins. But there are people who want to do the deep work, and they're not going to be able to have the amount of time and frankly, mental and emotional bandwidth. I have to pour so much into myself to be able to do this work. It's taxing. And so
Yeah.
how, we do need those on-ramps. So where are those on-ramps? And I think that's been my challenge. And I joined Felicia's, first event, and that was very useful because I was able to see, oh, all these things that I've been doing are kind of related, like Theory U, Danella Meadows, a whole bunch of other things. But I just didn't have that framework, and it would have been so helpful to know, and then I could just kind of go deep in certain pieces. So that's what I meant.
Yeah. Well, I agree completely.
Great. Thanks,
Yeah.
Suparna. And I see Yangbo, you have your hand up.
Yes. And what highly struck me around much of this conversation that really is worth diving deeper into is something I've been observing for really over a decade by now, ever since being first introduced to systems thinking in the late noughts, is what I'm finding is this excessive reliance on foundation grant or other types of nonprofit funding. And it just begs a question that have there been much ways of really building alternatives? For example, that are there low-hanging fruit, say, within things even, say, in California, say, within the startups? Because I see a lot that can be adapted from this lean startup approach, where I was lately reading that the moment you start asking someone to put in things like milestones and these, then right there, you just destroy the startup right there on a fundamental level, because there's really no way you can realistically achieve that until you've actually started real world trials. So has there been an effect of, and it's same with even with my approach with my lines of activity, where that there are some areas that are really bridging really both the more of the traditional types and more of the systemic change types, and using one end to bankroll the others. So sooner or later you get something that is self-reinforcing, self-sustaining, as opposed to, honestly, what I find is really many people I just find just wasting their time, honestly, going for grants, seeking foundation funding and such, where I can often tell by now it's hardly any of that's going to be forthcoming. So have there been much of an effort to really refocus on alternatives, as instead of literally asking people for handouts, rather why not actually bankroll it internally through whatever low-hanging fruit we can grasp?
The problem that I think you need to really watch out for is creating stuff that is actually catering to the existing system and becomes dependent upon the existing system, and then perpetuates existing system patterns. So I'm assuming that we're having a conversation about systemic process because we're interested in new ways of living, new ways of making sense of our world, new ways of studying our world, new ways of being in relationship with ourselves, each other, and the world. And so I guess the issue is that if it works in the existing system, it probably isn't systems change. And so that's an uncomfortable piece right there. And so how to think about, I guess in the warm data work, we use this term of getting parallel. One of the things that I see as really important is how to not need the existing system. How do we begin to support communities to not need those institutions with all of their processes and relational interdependencies with other institutions that are actually producing the problems. So, yeah. you know, there's a reach, okay? A man's reach should exceed its grasp. Else, what's a metaphor? There's a reach that's needed, and that reach is going to reach out of a lot of what is familiar. So that makes it difficult for things to get what we used to call traction. Never liked that word, but in existing system processes. Yeah.
Great. Well, I see, Jean, you have your hand up, and we're technically out of time for the Q&A, but Jean, if you want to just slip in your question real quick.
Well, it wasn't a question. It was, what I find reassuring is to go and find instances where groups of people have accomplished amazing things where everyone else said it was absolutely impossible. Go
Yes.
study the incredible edible Todmorden in the UK, where they turned the entire town into a food forest. It was amazing.
That's it. That's it, Jean. It's that thing of, you know, is it impossible? Great, that's the one. And just, you know, not compromising into, well, we can't do that because it's impossible. And at this point, there's just no more time. We just have to do the impossible. You know, what you said, that's exactly it. Of, you know, completely do the thing that is unthinkable. And that's where it goes. I don't know what else to say except for that for me, where I'm working with the warm data stuff, it's about opening up the perception to an entirely different vista of possibility. So I'm not really interested in what the action is, because that will take care of itself. The action will come out of those things that become visible in these new kinds of possible. But how to create perception and ways of actually, you know, seeing the world, being in those premises of how we see the world that lead us to actually do something totally different, where it's just reasonable to do something totally different, because what you're seeing is a world that's not based on what's the point, what's in it for me, where does this go, you know, what's the KPI, what's the outcome, what's the linear strategy, what's the those are all terminologies that come out of the engineering world, which is great for engineering, and it's not at all great for life.
Great. Very clear point. Thank you for that. So I want to take this bit about the impossible and move it into our somewhat more extended little breakout groups. We're gonna, by pre-arrangement, let Nora go just a few minutes early, given her teaching schedule this week. And if you guys want to unmute, and we'll clap for Nora.
Thanks, Nora.
Thank you.
Bravo.
Great. Well, thank you, Nora, so much for taking time out of your extremely busy schedule to join us all today. And we will look forward to hopefully connecting with you in the future, anytime we're here. And we've shared a couple things in the chat, and we can share more with this group as we go forward. So enjoy the rest of your evening there in England with your teaching.
Thank you so much. And it was wonderful to be here. And I just want to say something on an uplifting note, because I've been kind of like,
oh, sure.
Which is that what I'm seeing in the Afani Poesis work and the warm data work is that there is so much possibility. It's just not where we're looking. So it's not that there's not a lot of possibility. It's just not where we're looking. It's, you know, the street lamp problem. But looking somewhere else is a very radical thing to do. And so I invite you to look in other directions. And thank you so much for inviting me. It was wonderful to be here. And what a great project, too. Thank you for putting this together.
Great. Thanks so much, Nora. All right, great. So Carolina is going to, our helpful Zoom person in the background is going to put us all into 10-minute breakout groups where we're going to have a chance to have a little chat with each other. And I think there's going to be 3 or so, give or take, people in each person's group. And our kind of discussion point here is, you know, let's take this bit from Nora about the impossible, and you know, what's possible in terms of the impossible. And we'll take that. And of course, you know, as with all breakout groups, 50% of the purpose here is just for people to meet with each other and sort of share your thoughts and synthesize your thoughts.
Welcome back, everybody.
Welcome back. All right, any quick shares before we officially wrap up? Feel free to unmute yourself and share real quick if you'd like.
Just that you're doing very important work. Thank you. Really, this is very impactful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you to give us as well the opportunity to meet similar-minded people. I think that's really lovely as well. So thanks for that.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you for
Deep breath.
organizing it.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thank you.
Well, in that vein of connecting with others, I will share my screen just to give you a visual on a coming soon, which we talked about this in our last event. And then we'll also share in a moment about the kind of interstitial conversation we have. So this is a platform called P2, and we're putting together, it's still in process, the System of Systems Thinkers P2, which is kind of a hybrid of a website and I guess what you might call social media. But the idea is that these buttons are not all clickable at the moment, but the idea is that you'll be able to kind of show back up on here and you know, look at the resources for the past events, and then hopefully maybe even preemptively in the future upcoming events. So the recordings will be there, the chat log, and an opportunity to connect with others. So when we get this a little bit more together, we'll send out the invite to the group of those of you who participated today. So you'll have an invite link. I apologize that if you're not already a WordPress user or a little bit familiar with WordPress, there might be a little bit of a learning curve, but we'll work to make it accessible for those of you who are not familiar with the WordPress platform. So Carolina, did you want to mention about the interstitial in between events conversation?
Yes, so we're going to share here in the chat. I'm going to drop a link right now. Just as last time we did in between, we have our next conversation with Melanie Goodchild on relational systems thinking in June, towards the end of the month. And in the meantime, there is a link to a peer-to-peer discussion. So if you enjoyed these breakouts and would like to discuss the conversation today, with other like-minded folks for a longer period of time, we are organizing a discussion session on the 7th of June at 4 p.m. Pacific time. Apologies that I know this is the only time zone that I can think of at the moment. But I think if you register on Zoom, you'll be able to see the event in your own time zone. And also, I would also like to invite you all to register for our following conversation with Melanie Goodchild. And we will also send you the follow-up with the chat, with the link to this recording. So, and again, with these links that we just shared, plus resources on Nora's work. So please stay tuned. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks, everybody. And also, when you sign up for the upcoming events, feel free to make a donation. We are putting your dollars to good work to host our speakers. We're sending them a little thank you donations to support them. And of course, share the events with your friends, colleagues, countrymen and women, and gender fluid individuals. And thanks everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us all today.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Claire.